in, and we're delighted to have them in. And if you see people trying to find a seat, you have a seat nearby, please wave loudly or something. But there are some additional seats up front, and we're just delighted to have this kind of. I'm Walter Bennell, and I have the distinct privilege of being the president of the Salisbury Forum Board. And it's a great pleasure on behalf of the board and our host schools tonight, the Salisbury Schools, to welcome many of you, all of you, everyone, to the Salisbury Forum. If this is your first time with us, we are delighted that you found us. We hope that you tell others about us. If you're returning, and I know many of you are, welcome back to the beginning of our 5th season as a community forum for the exchange of ideas and the opportunity to listen to people with expertise on subjects of interest to us as a local community, as a region, as a country, and as citizens of the world. Certainly tonight we have that in spades in our 2 speakers. I'd be remiss if I didn't draw your attention to a couple of things in the program because my board would be upset if I didn't. One is that we really are trying to, the latest expression, harvest information about people who might be interested in knowing more about us. So in everyone's program tonight, there is a card that if you did not receive an email from us this week, that means we do not have your email address. Or if you've never received a mailing from us, that means we don't have your mail address, and we'd like to have one or both. And if you could fill that out, that would be wonderful. We truly appreciate it. Just this week, we launched what we think we're very proud of, a wonderful new website, which is going to enable us to provide a lot more content to you. And as we develop that, the opportunity for communication amongst ourselves and for people to respond and for us to continue to keep you informed, both about the topics of previous forums as well as future events. So we'd love it if you would sign up to receive that email or on our website. The other reason for this card is that at the end of our presentation, we will have the opportunity to collect questions from members in the audience and to do that rather quickly so that we can then quickly look through them and ask questions of our speakers. We learned early on that we did not want an open mic because an open mic becomes an opportunity for a lot of grandstanding sometimes, or for people who speak for a long time before they get to the question, and that takes a lot of time. So in the interest of communication, we just felt that it was best to do it this way. So if you think of a question you want to ask, write it down during the course of the thing, and members of the board, all of us are wearing these red, white, and blue lanyards. I apologize for buying them for my board this week, but they were the only thing on sale at the lanyard store, so that's what I bought. And we would love to have your feedback, of course. We wouldn't exist if it weren't for really 5 organizations that gave us the seed money to begin the Salisbury Forum 5 years ago. The town of Salisbury, Salisbury Library, which was really the birthplace of the idea. Claudia Kane, the director, really initiated the conversation. Salisbury School, the Friends of the Salisbury Library, and Hotchkiss School. Those 5 institutions gave us the money that helped us get started. Since then, 3 of those groups have been able to stay with us, and we wouldn't have survived without that support this year. And those are our host this evening, Salisbury, the Friends of the Salisbury Library, and Hotchkiss School. And to those 3 organizations, we're deeply indebted as well to many of you who have contributed to us and to our efforts. And those that have done so since July 1, since July 1, we hope acknowledged in our handout, also in our program tonight. And we hope that those of you who haven't yet had the opportunity will take advantage. There's a donation card in your program. You can contact us or send us, or even pass us, as someone did tonight, and ask me to check on your way out the door. But we're delighted to have the support of those who can offer it to us. And we will again acknowledge that that list of people at the end of our season. The founder of the Salisbury Forum and the founding president was a man who isn't with us tonight, and he had to be out of town, but it's Frank de Chambeau. And the board, when Frank stepped down from the role of president after 40 years, decided to recognize him, his special effort and his work, by holding the first lecture of the season in his honor. And so it is in the honor of Frank de Chambeau, the man who kept the forum alive, kept the dream alive, and kept the conversation going for 40 years. It is in his honor that we are having tonight's presentation. Rather than for me to talk anymore, what I've done is try to give you a lot of information about Bill Blakemore, Jeffrey Sachs, in the program that you have. I had to be cut twice because there was so much to be said about both of them in order to fit as much as I put in as I did. And we are deeply indebted to them for traveling here to the northwest corner. Very busy schedule that each of them has. Extraordinary people in their own fields, and it's an enormous pleasure to welcome to the Salisbury Forum Bill Blakemore and Jeffrey Sachs.
It's a great honor to be invited here. This is unfortunately an interesting time we live in, to quote that old Chinese saying. The news that comes into us journalists every week now from the scientists around the world about global warming is increasingly worrisome. As you're probably aware, many of us in the media can no longer find any real credible questions about the basics, the four basics as we think of them with global warming. And that is that it's happening, that it's caused by humans, that it's happening much faster than we thought only a short time ago, and that it's very dangerous and upsetting to civilization. Only 2 nights ago, I heard Jeffrey Sachs being interviewed by Howard Gardner down at 92nd Street Y. After the end of a fascinating evening describing his life's work, he was asked, what are the big problems, the big issue now? And Jeffrey said, if I may quote him, actually there's one big one which if we don't handle it right away, none of the others matter because it envelops all of them and immediately degrades them, and already is. When I asked Jeffrey on the phone just a few days ago, has anybody figured out exactly what the cost already is from global warming economically in the United States? He said, interesting question, and I'll ask him that again in just a moment. But he immediately said, of course, Kofi Annan's group has already come out, the Humanitarian Forum, with a study, and this is it, I looked it up immediately, that has estimated, Jeffrey will talk to us about the exactitude of this, that already there are 300,000 humans at least who are dying every year, who would not be dying were it not for human-induced global warming. The American Psychological Association has just recently put together a task force to deal with all of the many psychological aspects and dimensions of global warming. And I have brought, sorry about that, I have brought about 10 copies of a very important study that has just recently come out. That it's more than a study, it's a report from the government. Mike? Something wrong with the mic?
You're fading in and out.
I'm fading in and out. There is a mic fellow around here. 1, 2, 3, 4, is that better?
Yes.
All right. Go. I have about 10 copies up here with it. Hang on a second. A minor detail. Is this any better? 1, 2, 3, 4. Can you hear me now? Hang on. There are no technological fixes for global warming either yet. I just stick it in my pocket. All right. Put it wherever it seems to work best. 1, 2, 3, 4. Is that working? Yeah. Okay. This is a report that came out that was put together from a team that was put together under the last administration, Bush 2, global climate change impacts in the United States, and many of the graphs in here, which are wonderfully clear, talk about what has already happened in the last 30 years because of global warming, even broken down by region. You can see what's going to be happening around here in the northwest corner when you look at this. And a couple of other documents that may be of some interest, and which we will refer to. But mostly this evening, it's my job to be all I am, which is just a professional journalist. Beware of the word just there, because I think it's if you're professional, a matter of some power. But the economist of some note here, who has visited in his life's work as an adult 50 or 60 countries and helped them straighten out their economies, with the possible exception of a big one over there to the east. But mostly is very famous for helping turn around economies in Bolivia, in South America, in Central America, in Poland, as soon as they began to move communism, is Jeffrey Sachs. And my job this evening is mostly to help interview and bring out what Jeffrey Sachs has to teach us. We called this, after Jeffrey and I talked about this, 4 global crises: money, security, heat, and psychology. Psychology is something I've been looking into lately in terms of how the psychologists are beginning to figure out how to help us all understand what's happening to us humans in the course of these 4 global crises that are coming together, 5 or 6 crises actually, which are all becoming interlaced and are becoming one. So much for my introduction. That's the basic idea here, is for me to ask Jeffrey a few questions about how these different crises, we know we're in the middle of an economic crisis that's worldwide. We know that there are a number of worrisome security problems around the planet that are also getting worse because of the global warming, as we've seen from a number of intelligence reports that have just recently been made public, that for 5 or 10 years have been worked up by the CIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, and a number of other intelligence agencies around the world, looking at the national security problems that are being brought by global warming, the problems of hundreds of millions, possibly of climate refugees in the near future, and of course the heat in the title is global warming. But we start with economic realities. Jeffrey, we're calling it 4 global crises, but when I asked you the other day how they, questions about how they begin to fit together, how they interlace, one of my first questions to you was, has anybody yet measured the economic impact on us so far from global warming? And the answer?
First, let me say thank you to the Salisbury Forum, and thank you to you, Bill. And also, I hope the students aren't terrified by all the reading assignments coming up. It will be less painful than that. And I hope everybody's not depressed by your introduction about the range of crises. And indeed, driving here this afternoon from Manhattan, it's such a beautiful area. It sometimes probably is hard to think about crisis because you live in a beautiful part of the world, and it really was just a pleasure to come up here in the last couple of hours. Alas, we do have a lot of mess on our hands, though, and we are going to talk about that, I guess, for the better part of an hour and a half. And we don't know with precision just about anything about all of the various messes that we are going to talk about. The financial crisis still has its mysteries, how a seemingly functioning economy collapsed before our eyes, though it is in some recovery, what climate change means, what to do about it, how people think about it, which is Bill's specialty. So I'm afraid that in our discussion we won't be able to really discern the kind of precise answers. And what I would say to the students is, sorry, but it's going to be you to figure these things out. Not just in the classes, but really in the coming decades, because a lot of the problems we're talking about tonight are unfolding problems, and it's going to be the generation of today's students at Hotchkiss and Salisbury and the other schools here who will be facing these problems in a very serious way and having to grapple with them because we're not going to get them solved in the next few years. They're too complicated. And I can say, Bill, in one overarching way, the world is very complicated because it is more interconnected than ever before. It's more crowded than ever before. We're in each other's faces as never before. And we've now worked out ways to handle all of this. And the United States, which for many decades was clearly the dominant power of the world and called a lot of the shots, is also not in a position to do this on its own by any means. And so we're entering many uncharted parts of the future, whether it is how human beings are affecting the climate, and not just the climate, but the broader environment. We'll talk about that. How an interconnected global financial system works, and how we learn to handle all of this, because as I'm sure you can not only guess, as you know very well, whether it's explicit or just a feeling, we don't decide these things anymore. The United States is going to have to act in a different way and find partners to address all of these things. That's not the easiest thing for this country to do as well, because we're not used to it, we're out of practice, and even when President Obama says what I regard as completely realistic and reasonable things about global cooperation, he gets heatedly attacked, to use the word he, from the right, as some naive sap who trusts in others, and why don't we do it the usual way and impose our will. And the fact of the matter is we can't anymore. There is no such thing as an ability of the United States, 5% of the world, to impose its will on the other 95%. And so everything we're going to talk about, Bill, is complicated. You asked me the question, what do we know about the cost of climate change to date? What do we know? We know that the world has warmed on average by about 0.8 of 1 degree centigrade. And multiply that by 9/5, remember? So we're a little bit above 1 degree Fahrenheit warming. Doesn't sound like a lot, but we know it's already having pretty big effects in the world. That's the average for the whole planet. Recognize that as you go away from the equator towards the poles, as you move poleward, as it said, the change is greater. As you move towards the equator, it's less. That's because there are feedbacks as you go towards the equator. The ice melts, and the incoming solar radiation gets absorbed more, and so you get what the scientists call positive feedback. So the warming here is bigger than average in the world. The warming farther north is even greater than it is in Connecticut, for example. It's not just warming, of course, about this climate. It's changing the climate system, how it rains, where it rains, for example, so precipitation affects the nature of storms, the hurricane systems, the typhoons in the Indian Ocean and in the East China Sea and in the Pacific. It's not just the climate, by the way, and I'll just put this point quickly on the table, we'll come back to it. When we put carbon dioxide in the air by burning gasoline in the gas tank, or coal at a power plant, or natural gas at a power plant, or in our homes, all of that puts carbon dioxide in the air, and that causes climate change. But some of that carbon dioxide is also absorbed into the ocean. And when the carbon dioxide is absorbed in the water, you create, by H2O plus CO2, carbonic acid, H2CO3, and that acidifies the ocean. Makes it hard for all the animals that grow exoskeletons, the corals and other animals, to actually survive as the ocean acidifies. So we're actually changing the Earth's chemistry in a major way as well. And just not to filibuster because we're having a discussion, but just to put one more thought on the table, the way I think about it, we're just a very crowded planet right now. And this has come through generations of population increase. And not only are we a crowded planet, but we're pretty good at economic life. We've learned very well how to fish the oceans and how to drill for oil and how to produce automobiles and lots of things. And the impact, therefore, of 7 billion people nearly on the planet now was half of that in 1965, 3 billion. At the start of the industrial age, it was 1/10 of that, about 700 million. This massive increase in population all over the world, and all over the world now people understanding how to mobilize science and technology to produce things and have a higher living standard, means that the impact of what we're doing on the planet, whether it's burning coal to make electricity, or whether it is chopping down rainforests to grow feed grain for the meat that we like to eat, or whether it's fishing out almost every major fishery in the oceans of the world because we're so darn good at cleaning out the oceans right now, or whether it's tapping into the groundwater to irrigate crops and using up that groundwater in the US Midwest or China or India. I can go on and on. That impact of a crowded, productive planet is changing the planet in ways that were unimaginable even 40 years ago, and basically unknown to most of the world almost till today. And it's happening very fast, and it's coming very fast because a lot of the world is experiencing a lot of economic development, even if we feel, ugh, this is a miserable period. China still this year will grow 8%. 8% for 1.3 billion people. India will increase its economy also by maybe 7% this year. And this is our problem, Bill. That's good news. It's wonderful news in certain ways. We don't know how to handle all of this. Such a crowded planet, such an interconnected planet, a planet where the United States does not call the shots anymore. It's still the most powerful single country in the world. But we can't win a war in Afghanistan. No way. And we can't solve any of these problems on our own. And that's the problem that we're talking about. So you asked me a specific question, what's the cost of all of this so far? Who knows? What the insurance companies tell us is that they're paying hundreds of billions of dollars of claims on various kinds of climate-related shocks that go on each year, droughts and floods and hurricanes and so on. How much of that is really due to climate change? How much of that is simply the fact that people live in coasts and live in vulnerable areas, and a lot more of them live in those places than before, and they make a lot more money, and therefore when their property is destroyed, the losses are much bigger? Nobody knows for sure. I was on the advisory committee for that report of the Global Humanitarian Forum. I cringed a little bit because that report produced some specific numbers. I said, no way you can know those numbers. But they're indicative. They're indicative of a world facing lots and lots of shocks. And for the first time in our country, we're at least debating taking it seriously. It's taken us a long time. Maybe those reports you left on the floor were the only good things George Bush did about climate change, was leave behind a report, because what he really did was waste our time for 8 years entirely, and wasted the world's time. And now we're about to see whether the climate debate gets as ugly as the healthcare debate, because if we ever finish healthcare, next on the platter is climate change. And that's also going to be ugly, and it's going to be nasty, and we're going to hear stupidities all over the place. And the question for us is whether we can have a grown-up world or not to face this.
And as you all probably know, in Copenhagen, December 7 through 14, is going to be the meeting that's going to try with all of the countries of the world saying that they will be there to reach a global agreement on how we will finally put a price on carbon, so we'll no longer be free to put it in the air. Let me pick up on one point you just mentioned, though. You said we're finally taking this seriously. Just to take a brief historical look at what may have been a shift of paradigm within our country, which was built on the idea of a limitless, wonderful, natural world to go and extract from. Now we've got, as I believe a fellow named Kai Erickson calls it, a new species of trouble that you just referred to. There's not such a thing as natural disaster anymore. Earthquakes, it's the bad building. People are building along rivers where the floods are going to come. They're building along the oceans where the sea level is rising faster and faster. And is there not, would you say, Jeffrey, some kind of a shift towards a new psychological basis for what our economies can be based on, as opposed to just plundering nature?
It's a good question, and we're going to have to get to that pretty quickly. And as you say, it's not been our style, one might say. A lot of the great drama and success of modern human history is breaking into new frontier, exploring new ways, mobilizing resources as never before. When I started studying in college, which was for me 1972, I don't know, probably many of you read or heard about Limits to Growth, the Club of Rome book. You raise your hand if you've heard about it. Yeah. That was a book that came out 37 years ago that said we were going to hit some limits. And I was a freshman in college, and it was the second book I read in freshman year in my economics class. Mainly, actually, for the professor to make fun of the book. Because it always stuck with me, of course, for 37 years. Limits to growth, come on, they didn't do the model right, they didn't understand if a resource gets scarce, its price will go up, and that will stimulate technology, and we'll be able to solve the problem. And there have been dire predictions throughout history, and they've always been proved wrong, and so and so and so and so. And it's conceivable, you could say that again, but I doubt it. And this takes us back, maybe it's worth taking us back, actually, 211 years, just for a moment, to Thomas Malthus. Everybody knows the name Malthus and Malthusian pessimism. Malthus said, gee, we're stuck on this planet at a low living standard because if the living standards ever go up, people will have more children, population will increase, and that will drive the living standards back down. And that didn't happen exactly that way because Malthus predicted that the human population would always grow at a geometric rate. It would double every some decades, whereas the food supply would only grow at what he called the arithmetic rate. It could only increase at a fixed rate, and therefore he said population would always overtake the ability to feed the population eventually, and we'd be driven down to hunger and so on. Then for 2 centuries, since he wrote that in 1798, and now we're 211 years later, well, we stayed way ahead of the curve. And what economists were trained for a long time, and that's why my professor made fun of this Limits to Growth book, is that human ingenuity could outpace even something as dramatic as a 10-time increase of population. And so don't worry about it, there's always the next good thing to do. And there's an important element of truth in that, and we'll talk about that, I'm sure, in a few minutes when we talk about some solutions to things. But the thing that I want to say right now is we haven't really proven Malthus wrong yet, even though we apparently have, we live at living standards that he couldn't even have fantasized in the wildest of fantasies. But the point is that what we learned a lot about in 2 centuries was how to mine natural resources better and how to use what we're able to mine. And you could talk about mining in also a metaphorical way. We mine the oceans of fish, and we mine the groundwater to irrigate crops. It's not just the mining of iron and copper and oil and coal and so forth. So we're living not only because we're so clever, but also because we're taking the Earth's resources at a remarkable rate. And so Malthus hasn't been, it's not been proved right, but he hasn't been proved wrong either, because the question is whether what we're doing is sustainable. And here I want to just make a basic observation. It's literally the case, the following proposition. We can't continue to do what we're doing today to the planet with our current technologies, even for a few decades more. We're unsustainable in not a figurative, metaphorical, moral sense, though one could argue about any of those, but just in a literal sense, that what we're doing right now is hitting limits that are breaking the planet.
Even without global warming.
Well, global warming is one of them. But to grow food, we're chopping down most of the remaining forest. This is an interesting part of the world, by the way. One of the few places where this used to be all farmland in the 19th century, and then when the farms moved to the Midwest because of rail and shipping and more land, this was reforested into this wonderful semi-forest, the secondary, tertiary growth that we have in this part of the country. But most of the world has been really deeply, deeply degraded, and that process is continuing very rapidly, especially in the three great rainforest areas that remain in the world, which is the Amazon, the Congo Basin, and Southeast Asia, especially Indonesia and Malaysia. And I was in Malaysia this summer. When you drive into the countryside, as I did, coming at you the other direction is truck after truck after truck of giant tropical hardwoods just being gutted in areas that aren't supposed to be forested at all. And I just was snapping pictures. I mean, to see these beautiful logs, also the tragedy of it, because these are trees that were probably a century or more old, and just being cleared in the particular part of Borneo where I was. So that's one way. Another way is the groundwater, something we don't think very much about, but a lot of our food supply comes from irrigated water. And a lot of our water, in fact, all the most productive farmland in the world is irrigated. In fact, as you need good water control for crops, you have to get the water from someplace. The two ways we get the water are from river flow. And we've put, you know how many dams, ladies and gentlemen, we have in the world on fairly major dams? More than 50,000 major dams on the rivers around the world. So a lot of our rivers don't even reach the ocean anymore, like the Rio Grande, which I call the Rio Pequeño, because it doesn't even flow to the sea. The Ganges, the great Ganges, the mother river of Indian civilization, does not flow to the ocean anymore. The Yellow River does not flow to the sea anymore. So that's one way we are in danger. And the other way is we tap groundwater. And that groundwater either is something that's gradually recharged, or if it's deeper, it's what's called fossil water, like fossil fuel. It was put down there 20,000 years ago. When it goes, it's gone. And a lot of the most populous parts of the world are tapping that groundwater either much faster than the recharge rate or into real fossil water. And we're working in many parts of the world, the scientific institute that I direct at Columbia University, in places where the water table is falling 5 meters a year, for example. And up above just happen to be tens of millions of people that depend on that right now. So that's another sense in which we're unsustainable. I'll give you another one, just to cheer all of you up. Yeah, we haven't even begun to talk about Wall Street yet. But to grow this food, we had to have a great breakthrough, which occurred in 1908. And that was to learn how to get the nitrogen from the air back into the ground by chemical fertilizer. So if there are fans of organic foods here, and I'm sure there are, let me just stipulate there's no way in the world that organic farm systems could feed 7 billion people. And you can kind of note it by the food being more expensive when it's organic. Takes more land, because either I won't go into all the issues, but the point is, a discovery was made in 1908 to break the triple bond of atmospheric N2 nitrogen, dinitrogen molecules, and to put it into nitrates, which can be used by plants for food production. And that's what urea and other chemical nitrogen-based fertilizers are. We need that to grow enough food to feed most of the planet, and we don't feed all of the planet. Remember, there are a billion deeply hungry people on the planet, so we haven't exactly solved the feeding all the people problem. But most of the world uses nitrogen fertilizer. The place that does not, the main place is Africa, that does not use nitrogen fertilizer. I'm working in Africa, I see hungry or starving people all the time. They can't afford the fertilizer. But for those of us who can afford the fertilizer, we're putting more than 100 million tons of nitrogen onto the ground every year. And that's a lot. It's more than nature cycles nitrogen through biology and lightning and other ways that atmospheric nitrogen biologically or physically gets back into the earth, what we're doing. So why do we care? Well, the good news is that's how we grow enough food to feed, like I say, maybe 6 of the 7 billion people on the planet. Why do we worry? Because that nitrogen doesn't just go to the plants, it goes into the water supply. It goes into the groundwater. It gets carried into the rivers. And then it shows up in what all of you know as that dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico, the so-called hypoxic zone. And that's a process where you get this rush of nutrients, and that leads to algal blooms and then takes away the oxygen from the estuaries. Now, what's the problem with that? Well, it kills all the marine life in a large area, but there's a bigger issue. About 130 major river systems now around the world have the dead zone that we know about in the Gulf of Mexico. About 130. So that's just another sign we're punishing this planet a pretty heavy way right now. And what we haven't done is really reflected deeply and seriously about it. And in our country, we barely catch our breath to have the kind of wonderful opportunity for discussion we're having tonight. But we certainly don't have it in general in the country.
And just to add a little bit of trouble to that trouble.
Thanks.
I mean, not to report the worst case scenarios would be grossly irresponsible of a basic journalistic endeavor or an academic one. In the last month, we have heard 2 studies done, one of which said that if all of the countries were to fulfill their current promises for cutting greenhouse gas, we would still warm by 6.3 degrees centigrade, which puts us way above what the world scientists have agreed is dangerous. And in any case, as we're going now, it looks like a likely 4 degrees centigrade increase. To translate that, that's well up at the far end of the worst case scenarios estimated by the scientists even 2 or 3 years ago. In other words, stopping global warming, and I figure I better bring in the worst case scenario right now that the scientists are beginning to talk about publicly, means trying to figure out how to stop this rapid, accelerating increase of temperature on the planet very soon, because at some point, as you've all probably read and know about, there is an overall tipping point that they see in the paleoclimatological record, at which, when the Earth, alternating as it always has so far between greenhouse, when there's no ice or snow on the planet, but a lot of dinosaurs, and icehouse, we're in the middle of an icehouse period now with a lot of little ice ages. When you put a lot of carbon back up in the air, at a certain point, in the middle of that process, there's an overall tipping point in which the heat is so much that it starts to thaw out all of the masses of carbon and methane that are frozen into the tundra and into the seabeds, and it becomes a runaway process. More gets released, it gets warmer, more gets released, it gets warmer, and it goes zipping right back up to 1,000 parts per million of carbon in the atmosphere as opposed to the 378 that we have right now. This, on top of everything that Jeffrey has been talking about, if I'm not mistaken, Jeff, is an additional speed-up urgency that we've got on all of this, because those same scientists are reporting to us that they estimate now that the Tibetan Plateau, which has watered 6 major rivers of the world since time immemorial, could dry up and melt out within 30 to 50 years. That's the Indus River, the Ganges River, the Mekong River, the Brahmaputra, the Yellow River, the Yangtze, and all of these in areas that you're working in. So on top of these problems you're talking about, we've got this additional worry that we have a hard time looking at. It's time for us to begin to look at give a sense of where you think solutions might be, of course, but via Wall Street, via what's happening in the current, oh, it sounds like a small little economic problem, a little blip in the midst of these much bigger problems. How do you see, in the midst of all of this, with this growing psychological future trauma impact on our thinking and our sense of security, what's happening to the economic crisis in the world right now?
Whoa. Of course you're right, but I'm just taking it in.
I mean, just to mention, I mean, our problem here is a conciliant problem. We have to look at the whole interconnected mess altogether, because what we're realizing, and I've heard you say and so many other people say more and more, is this is a stovepipes problem. The stovepipes have all been, people have been happy and satisfied in their individual jobs, their individual realms of profession. The journalists haven't really been talking to the scientists, haven't really been talking to the economists. We all get comfortable with jobs, but now the globe has shrunk so much that these crises are all affecting each other. That's my first question. How much has global warming affected the economy so far? Our national security is in real trouble. In the midst of all of this, how do you see that economic crisis we're in the midst of relating to this?
Let me take it from a slightly different point of view, just to pick up, and I want to cheer us up a little bit. All of what Bill and I have been saying should suggest, of course, how dangerous the current trajectory is. But it doesn't suggest that it's impossible to solve, and that's really where a good brainstorming society, a problem-solving society, would take up the challenge. And that, in many cases in history, has been one of America's strongest points, of course, that as a free society and with incredible institutions, depth of learning, depth of science, and a resolve in society at various times to address these problems, we've been able to rally. Suppose we did rally, and I think we very well may rally. What would we rally about? How would we do this? And I want to just introduce a basic concept that I think is important. And that is that for all of the problems that we have of this particular kind, because we have other problems too. We don't trust each other. We don't deal with each other very well. We've got nuclear weapons. We've got the whole headache of modern humanity. But of this physical Earth variety, which is unusual for us because we were out there, building industry and so on, and now we do find there really are limits. What can we do about it? And the key idea that I think is the right idea is to find technologies, ways of doing things that can keep our living standards but not impose such high costs on the planet. And to do that in a way which requires both new invention, but also a new kind of economy that gives the right signals to all of us, and especially to the industry and the power plants, and when we choose our cars and so forth, to make the right kinds of technological choices. So, what does this mean in practical terms? When you look at where this climate change is coming from, that's from the greenhouse gases, of which the most important is carbon dioxide. And the most important source of human-produced carbon dioxide is burning fossil fuel. The second most important source is chopping down rainforest. Okay. Then there are a couple of other very important greenhouse gases. One of them is methane. That's another kind of molecule which traps heat on the planet. So where does the methane come from? That also has a pretty mixed up history. It comes from our landfills and our dumps. It comes from our rice paddy fields. anaerobic respiration, and it comes from our livestock, our ruminants. 2/3 out the mouth, 1/3 out the back end, roughly speaking. And then we have a third greenhouse gas, and that's nitrous oxide, N2O. Where does that come from? Mainly from the fertilizer use. So the way I think about this, and the way many of my colleagues think about this, is to say, okay, what are we going to do about each one of these things? How are we going to get this under control? Now, one obvious thing is if the big ticket items are coal-fired power plants or automobiles that use gasoline or deforestation, you need to do something to get each of those under control. The power plants, we have different ways to produce electricity. I don't like the choice of not using electricity. By the way, I work and live in communities that don't use electricity. It's really hell. We don't want that. We actually want our power and to be able to use it. We don't want to waste it, but we do want to be able to use it. And the world's going to want to use more and more electricity. So we need to find safer ways to produce it. This raises a lot of questions. So far, everything that's been proposed, wind power, say. People say, oh, I don't like the look of those windmills. Solar power, oh, no, you could upset the ecology of the desert where they want to put these mirrors. Nuclear power, which doesn't emit carbon dioxide, well, that's obviously dangerous, says the public. And what remains then is the inertia of coal-fired power plants, which are 100% surely terribly dangerous, but in a kind of growing way that we don't necessarily respond to. My own view, by the way, nuclear, solar, wind, I take them all above coal-fired power plants, including, let me underscore, nuclear. I think we better get back in this country to a nuclear industry, which we suspended 30 years ago with 3 Mile Island. All issues to discuss, debate, and so on. But this is a set of problems. Another one, automobiles. You know, I like to say that our lobbyists, who are just the most relentless force of nature, even more relentless than climate change. I mean, we've got to make, it's like science fiction watching the lobbyists eat up Congress every day. But they're so good that they lobby their industries to bankruptcy. That's how I think about it now. GM was such a great lobby, it lobbied itself into extinction almost. Because it changed nothing. It said we're going to produce SUVs forever. And it ended up eventually, people, at least enough of us, understood SUVs was really not the right way to go in the world. At least SUVs using internal combustion engines was not the right way to go. Now, by the way, Wall Street did the same thing. It lobbied so successfully for deregulation that it nearly destroyed the world economy. And so these lobbyists are our #1 political problem in this country, by far. It's disgusting. It looks nothing like normal politics anymore. And I'm going to come back to that in just a moment. But the point is, with automobiles, what could you do? You could put a battery under the hood rather than an internal combustion engine, recharge it each night on a grid that is powered by solar power, and you don't have carbon dioxide emitted from that. Well, the list goes on and on. And the way I view the problem is, how do we get from here to there? And that's really a great policy problem. That I commend to all of the students who are going to be running this stuff. You can put a price on carbon dioxide so it's not free to emit it. You can mandate that we're just not going to build coal-fired power plants anymore that let the carbon dioxide go up in the air and so forth. But the first thing you do is you think about it, and you acknowledge that it's an honest problem, and you discuss and debate it. So here comes the real problem in our country right now, in my opinion. When's the last time we had an adult conversation about any political issue in this country? I mean, are we really a bunch of nitwits in this country? And I think this whole thing about people yelling at each other is total fabrication. as far as I can see. I do not think that's what America is about. You haven't yelled at me once. Of course, we're in Connecticut, it's different. But even beyond that, I travel all over the country, and people don't actually shout at each other, except in these incredibly contrived things, or these idiots like Glenn Beck and so forth. I don't watch TV, but I know he's an idiot, and I know he's a danger for this country, and Rupert Murdoch is a shame for this country to run a network like Fox News. It's a disgrace. So how do we actually pull back and be grown-ups again? That's what we have to do. Kids are more grown-up than we are. So how do we go back and do this? What's really wrong, though, I was just in Washington a couple days ago, talking about the climate legislation with very, very senior administration officials. You know what really goes on? It's all top to bottom special interests, morning till night. There's not a serious thought in the head of a lot of our senators and congressmen right now, I'm sorry to say, because it's all lobbyists morning till night. Our political system's really wrecked right now. Now, here's another thing. I happen to really like our president a lot. But look at how he's doing politics right now. He's doing politics with the lobbies. His judgment is, that's how I have to do it. And he may be right. I like him, I trust him, but I don't like this process at all. So far, this is not change that he promised. So far, this may be very clever, successful, I hope, to get certain things done. But, you know, I was briefed about the votes on climate coming up. It was not the kind of briefing I'm used to. And I've been doing this for a long time. It was what every senator is demanding is their pound of flesh to vote for the climate bill. That often has nothing to do with climate, by the way. This is what we call the world's greatest deliberative body. It's wrecked right now. We've just got to get these lobbyists the hell out of there, sorry. We've got to. And start talking about serious things in the country again. And that's what happened on Wall Street too, by the way. What's the real cause of this crisis in the end? That they deregulated the financial markets. Greenspan may be ideological. He loved Ayn Rand and didn't understand she was a novelist. Honestly, he took this stuff seriously. But his buddies around, they were on the pay. And so we're not going to regulate credit default swaps and other things. And they were making so much money in this deregulated environment that they built up all these toxic assets that ended up nearly bankrupting the world. Then they got bailed out, by the way, because their friends are all over the damn place in Washington. But it was good to bail them out in a certain way. I mean, we needed to bail them out because otherwise the whole economy would have imploded. But we don't need to let them now take $30 billion of bonuses after we bail them out. So this is really, but they're going to take them because I think the White House and the Treasurer are going to say, look, you know, they earned that. They're that close to saying that. It's really, I mean, maybe they're going to limit a little bit. Let's watch what Goldman Sachs takes home, and that's the other side of the Sachs family. Very, very distant. No relation at all, I should make clear. Not that I've discovered. If I did discover it, maybe I'd feel differently about it. But none that I've ever discovered. And so the question really, deep down, and I'll just stop my little rant here, is the following. The world's really complicated right now. Really complicated. And it's really a strange, fascinating world. And I sometimes, you know, leave New York City at night and then end up after a flight and then a connection and a drive, by the next evening in a place without food and no water and children dying and no electricity, because that's, you can do that in a day's travel. And you can't believe it's the same planet. And you know the kinds of solutions that could come to those things if we were thinking seriously like grown-ups about how we could help to make real change in that kind of circumstance. And you know about climate and the other problems and how these are tough problems. They're not simple problems. And after 100 years of the internal combustion engine, it's not from one year to the next to get something new. And we don't actually want to turn off the economy. We could stop greenhouse gas emissions, but we couldn't feed the planet if we did that right now. So we've got lots of complicated things to do. When I was growing up, I thought the world was, led by serious people who would try to solve complicated problems. And that's how I really think the world should be. And a few years ago, I guess maybe 10 years ago, I stopped watching television at all. Sorry, Bill. Because I know you do a great job, but I couldn't stand even watching what passes for our public discussion right now. And I catch it in the airports, and it's shocking to me how we do, and Bill's one of the great journalists, you see how he knows everything about this issue top to bottom. But the level of our discussion in this country is so bad. I'm going to turn it back over to you for answering how we're going to get this better. It's not that these are unsolvable problems, but they're tough ones, and they're complicated, and they're not going to be solved easily. And I'll tell you, there's no way in the world that one of them is going to be solved militarily. Just I want you to understand that. We can't win in Afghanistan. We can't win in Iraq. The only thing that we can possibly do is work with other countries jointly to solve problems together. And we haven't been doing that for a long time, for a very long time. And it's been bipartisan neglect. And the lobbies infest both political parties. It's not just one or the other, it's both. Wall Street may be closer to the Democrats than the Republicans. Oil was closer to the Republicans. But it's bad on both sides right now. So the problem isn't that we're doomed. The problem is that we're not opening our eyes. So, Bill, how do we open our eyes? Well, you're talking to the public, you're seeing, you're trying to do public education. What do you think we should do?
Well, first of all, I'm a professional journalist. I'm not an environmentalist. I'm not an activist. I'm not trying to slow down global warming 1 minute. It is my job to bring you news. It's not our job to educate the public, but if we're good journalists, we inevitably end up doing that because we have to give context. Because what we want you to do is get what we have to tell you. As soon as we know you've got it, then we rush off. Professional journalists are not activists. They're less important than activists, but we play a role. So I've been looking very much at the psychological impacts because obviously one of the things that means my audience has a hard time sometimes wanting to listen, even my editors, even myself, is the psychological resistance that I find we run into. And this I knew early on was going to be the case in my own shop when Andrew Morrison, one of my favorite executive producers, took to introducing me around when we were having a meeting. I said, "This is Bill Blakemar, our end of days correspondent." And because I was reporting global warming. And as I started out being here today, it would be irresponsible for me not to report the worst case scenario. And yet, as I said to president of ABC News 3 years ago, after I started focusing on this story, I'm getting some resistance. Don't get me wrong, I'm very proud to work for ABC News, where when I brought these concerns about the fact that we weren't covering global warming 5 years ago, they said to me, "You've got some convincing to do, just do what you do." And to be a professional journalist is to want to be edited, to go through the due process of editorial process, but do it well. But I said to my bosses, look, I know that no two editors are going to come at this with the same medley of denial needs and little gaps in their middle school knowledge about science. the beginning of understanding the psychology of it came when I talked to a number of psychologists talking in the current paradigm of psychology, who talk about the fact that we all have meaning systems that can get threatened when we're traumatized, even by future traumatic predictions. And so what we do initially very often is resist what we're being told as a natural instinct to hold our act together, to buy a little time to deal with it. But the healthy thing to do is to then start to deal with this new reality we're being given. What's interesting right now is that the story that is coming at us, the crisis that is coming at us, is unprecedented. Among my profession, for example, editors know how to cover wars, we know how to cover elections, we know how to cover economics, we know how to cover health. We don't know how to cover global cataclysm. It takes a while to get used to having to say this, and yet the leading scientists, many of whom work near Jeffrey, whom he knows, and he can affirm what I'm going to say now, in the last 5 years have come out of the closet about what they used to tell us only when the cameras were off. They would say things in off-the-record seminars like, as I heard up at the Harvard Kennedy School once, you've probably heard similar things at the Earth Institute. Eminent scientists who are respected by their peers around the world, and scientists are interesting because they don't get ahead by agreeing with each other, they get ahead by being surprising. They would tell us things like, we don't like to tell the public how bad it is because we don't want to paralyze them. Oh, that's a bit of a psychology story, I thought. The psychology story has advanced greatly. I've just discovered a couple of days ago that the APA, the American Psychological Association, has created a task force on the interface between psychology and global climate change. Let me just read you their 6 categories. The interface between psychology and global climate change. They're trying to figure out how their profession can help throughout this, and this is going to be published online within a month, I believe. Section 1. How do people understand the risk? Sorry, is the microphone off again?
Yes.
I don't know why. Was I sitting on it? Because I moved? It's bad. Don't move. All right. Let me just read you this very quickly. Section 1. How do people understand the risks imposed by climate change? There's a whole library of psychology about how people understand this. Section 2. What are the human behavioral contributions to climate change and the psychological and contextual drives of these contributions? So the psychology of why we just want to go and keep doing what we know we shouldn't do. 3, what are the psychological impacts of climate change? How is it affecting our children's fears, our own denial? Section 4, how do people adapt to and cope with the perceived threat unfolding from climate change? The psychology of adaptation. 5, which psychological barriers limit climate change action? What keeps us from acting well? This is just to give you a sense of what is something that is summarized by the climate model. Section 6, how can psychologists assist in limiting climate change? They're starting to think about how can we help, as a profession, help prepare the public's mind to do this. 2 quick anecdotes and then we'll get down to questions from all of you. The climate modelers who 30 years ago with computers primitive by today's standards continue to tell us that whenever they put all of their data into their climate models to try to project what's going to happen in the future, the biggest unknown, quote unquote, is not something about carbon or about clouds or about how volcano aerosols are going to reflect sunlight. The biggest unknown in the climate models is always, what will the humans do? That's what the climate modelers don't know how to figure out in the future. That's why psychology and action in front of us is so important. We are the biggest unknown. The other thing I just wanted to just mention very quickly here, as we go to your questions, is one word, one place that can begin to be a fascinating point of study for all of the strains that Jeff has been talking about is China. Their government currently does not seem to be broken in the same way as that Jeffrey has described ours. What we're hearing from the scientists who have come back all summer from China in the U.S.-Chinese negotiations is that China is expecting and hoping to become a world power by offering better and cheaper green technology to the rest of the world than any other country can. And that's one of the reasons, and they have other reasons as well, that they may already be ahead of us and taking a leadership position in the battle against this potential catastrophe. Just finally, to make sure that we haven't skipped over this for all of you, the reality that we're living with and having to psychologically bear, the other anecdote I was going to mention is simply that there's hardly a day I don't get pulled out of denial, though I talk to the scientists all the time, about this story when I find out more and more about how rapidly it's coming. What they're telling us now is that the ice sheets are melting, as they've seen this summer, at a much faster rate than they were predicting 2 years ago. That the Earth's system is far more sensitive to greenhouse gas than they were predicting even 2 years ago. And so we have even less time than we thought. In other words, what they're saying is that there could be a collapse of world agriculture with hundreds of millions, possibly above a billion climate refugees clamoring to get across borders and producing a kind of chaos if we go on with business as usual and don't manage to bring down carbon that would upset all economies because it's such a global system as we've recently discovered. Does anything I've just said now strike you as being out of the realm of reality, or is it just time to go to these questions?
You know, I think the one, I've talked to our own psychologists about this, and there's one thing that I think that is left out of the list, frankly.
Oh, good. Something else bad?
No, something else good. And that is that if we had more clarity about what to do, we would rouse ourselves better to do it. And so I think probably the main thing that's lacking right now, in my opinion, is actually the what to do part. And that's where I would like to see some leadership from the president. He, because of the way politics works, doesn't want to get ahead of the Congress, et cetera, and we're tied up in political knots. But actually, I do believe that if we had more clarity, that there is a way out, and that there are strategies, and that this is what we could do, this would also help to galvanize us, take away some of the paralysis, and take what is undoubtedly a frightening subject and make it an object for some inspiration and some innovation. If you remember Al Gore's movie, Inconvenient Truth, and I'm sure many of you saw it, for all the very powerful and good things that it didn't have anything about solutions till the very end roll of the credits. If we proceed that way, we're never going to get to where we need to get. So I think the time is arriving where all of the fear needs to be explained. It's an absolutely legitimate and real thing to do. But the story now has to be, so what do we do now?
And notice that word fear, one of the most famous psychological anecdotes of all time, 1933, FDR said, and the way he said it is as important as what he says. We have nothing to fear but fear itself. And he said it in that bright way. We have nothing to fear, he was smiling, pause, but fear itself. Intersubjective affect regulation, as he was saying. Be like him. What I've heard psychologists say is what he was telling us, and all leaders do this at the point that they're finally ready to get a big bunch of people to follow them to do something difficult, is they do meta-psychology. Basically, FDR was saying to the public, be your own shrinks, get a grip. Henry V does it, Shakespeare knew this instinctively. Other great leaders at the beginning of it have said to the public, handle your own psychologies. And so people could start saying, oh yeah, there's a psychology to this, and that means that they could immediately start. Before they've been feeling bad about global warming. Now they can start just feeling bad about global warming because they understand it's normal to feel bad about feeling bad. Now we're ready for questions.
Thank you very much. I'm not sure whether I feel good or bad, but I'm delighted that you've been here to engage us in this conversation. I do have to make one little, for the members of the community who aren't quite accustomed to private school life, boarding school life, students have classes tomorrow, and most of them probably have homework to do. So I'm going to give them permission right now, if they need to leave, to go be prepared for their class tomorrow. if you do that, we'd love to have you stay, but I also know that your first grade teachers will not understand why your assignment isn't done if you haven't done it yet. So if you could quietly leave. On that same score, while board members are collecting questions from you, if you just raise your hand, for those who can stay, and indeed for all of us, what can you, or we, tell our students is the one thing they can actually start doing tomorrow to take better care of our planet?
I hope they were doing it tonight, listening, which I think is important. And tomorrow, studying a little bit of the physics and chemistry and politics of this issue. And I don't mean it facetiously. The first step is understanding. The second step, actually, for us, is not what you do in your home to turn off the lights or other things, even though that's a popular thing to say. The next step to do for us is to be good citizens and to demand action. And to learn enough to be able to, once again, from a New England town meeting to your congressperson and your senators, to say, let's get this done right now. Send the lobbyists home. We don't want to see you dealing with the lobbyists. We want to see you dealing with the issue. And this, I think, is also the students are entering citizenry and preparing to be good citizens, I think, is really the next step. Over time, we'll have better options. I mean, there are things in our personal lives we can do, kind of car we drive, the kind of life we choose to live. But really the big solutions, I have to say, are going to come through our collective decision making, because as important as all of that is the kind of power plan that is going to bring you the power. That's not your individual choice. Turning on the light from or leaving on the light from a solar powered grid is not going to have any effect, any adverse effects. A lot of what is going to be meaningful for us is what kind of system we have, what kind of cars are being produced, what kind of electricity is being produced, and that is, again, a public policy decision. So it's usually popular to say, let's get our own individual lives in order. I think there's always a case for that. But I also want to stress the citizen part of this. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. There are actually a number of questions revolving around the education thing, so let me just stick with a couple of those right now. What do you see as the essential skills or attitudes or competencies that are necessary for our students to have to face the world?
My own case is for students to understand that they're growing up in a world, not only a local community, though a local community is a wonderful, it's the indispensable base for a healthy life, but understanding that they're part of a whole interconnected world right now, I think is vital. And not necessarily a hostile world, just a world. It becomes hostile depending on how we deal with it. It's not intrinsically hostile. It's a world of difference, it's a world of variety, it's a world of complexity, and it's a world that is unavoidable in some sense in the future. They'll have 8 billion people on the planet when they're young adults. It's going to be an awfully crowded world. Learning to deal across cultures, having the experience, and this is a privileged community. They should know it, but they should use that privilege effectively also to be able to visit places, understand them. One of the things I want to recommend to Salisbury and Hotchkiss also, and I'd be happy to help on this specifically as well, is to make connections with schools in Africa, make connections with schools in very different places. Video conference can now connect students from in the villages, by the way, we're doing this. where there's now wireless broadband, and we're having students connect with New York City students, public school students. So I would like Salisbury and Hotchkiss also to make those connections so that our students can really see life in a different place. That's not, and they will learn an incredible amount by such interactions. And so that's another part of it. Let me not forget, by the way, you know, of course, do your math, learn your science, a mastery of basic understanding of our highly technological world that is itself based on basic science is vital. I'm not talking about not reading wonderful novels and looking at wonderful art and listening to wonderful music, but I am saying that a technical understanding of this complex, artificially built world that we live in is also a very important piece of this. And for that, no algebra. It's important.
I'd like to add, or just to sort of broaden the scope. I know you didn't intend it, but we actually are beginning very strong efforts of cooperative learning and engagement among all the schools in the area, Housatonic Valley Regional High School, as well as Hotchkiss and Salisbury, and you can be sure we have your number.
Good.
So, and we have the equipment, so we'll work with you on that. And just to get the kids off the hook for a minute and come back to several people asked this question around the issue of what causes the lack of this adult conversation. What needs to happen to change that? How do we create change to get the adults talking about this?
That can be partly a question about the people that use the media. I wish that more and more people, especially students, young kids, would be taught to be, or ask their teachers to teach them to be much more skeptical about what they see on any of the media. The three television networks are losing viewers steadily because the internet is taking over. And I think one of the most hopeful signs in the middle of all of this, almost like a miraculous coincidence, at the same time that we're bringing this upon ourselves, we've also invented the World Wide Web, with Skype, with realclimate.org, with climateprogress.org, with smart boards in your classrooms. I don't know if you have them yet, but
We do.
You do?
We all do.
Already, I mean, the journalists of the world, and let me just parenthetically say something here. The two phrases, the media and professional journalists, are in no way synonymous. The media are physical things, like ink and paper, like electromagnetic waves on screens, like clay and sticks. Professional journalists are one of dozens and dozens of professions that use the media. So it's important always to recognize that professional journalists have no guarantee to give you except their credibility, and what you need to do is sharpen your own instincts about who you find most credible coming over any of the media. And all of us, for example, at ABC News now, of course, we do print articles, we do television articles, we do podcasts, we do Twitters and tweets, and I can't even keep up with terminology. But miraculously, do you not find hope? You're just talking about this yourself, Jeffrey. Great hope in the fact that just as we're having this worldwide catechism bearing down upon us and already started, we do happen to have, coincidentally at the same time, a worldwide web by which we might be able to compare notes with each other and say, you guys in Bangalore are having the same problems I have in Kansas City. This is exciting to me what you're talking about, building these links.
It's not quite a coincidence because it is our great technology, in this particular instance, it's our great technological capacity that has gotten us into the mess and has a chance of getting us out of the mess. So it is the paradox, it's the double edge of this particular phenomenon. We're very good at a lot of things. Good enough to wreck the planet, good enough to save the planet.
One quick anecdote about this. When I discovered that our editors would take Skype on ABC news shows, I suddenly, and you all know what Skype is, it's if you can make a video phone call conference with anybody on the planet for 0 pennies if they happen to have the same Mac computer or something similar. I suddenly realized that I could interview any scientist on the planet I wanted to and didn't have to worry about the budget because it didn't cost anything. And we're now Skyping with scientists all over the world that I could never have dreamed of going to before because I would have had to fly out there. So it's happening fast.
There have been several questions about the whole international relations, if you will, and one, how does the concept of national security make any sense in an interdependent world? Surely only international or global security can truly be the answer.
I think that the main problems that we face can only be solved through cooperative action at this point. And that's true of our particular security issues. That's why these two wars that we got ourselves in were really a pretty serious mistake, pretty messed up diagnosis. I'm really hoping President Obama doesn't deepen the bet, but there are signs that he will, which would be a huge mistake in my view to send more troops to Afghanistan. I work in a lot of places, usually not in violent conflict. I'm not great when bullets are flying around. I'm a development economist, and that requires a measure of peace. But I work in a lot of places that are either just emerging from conflict or are on the boundaries of conflict. For instance, in the northeast corner of Kenya near the Somalia border. So a lot of Somali refugees and so forth. And what I know on the ground is that most of the places where we have conflict, whether it's Darfur or Somalia or Yemen or Afghanistan or Pakistan, at the core of these problems, people are hungry and they don't have a living and their children aren't in school. And that's the beginning of what we face. Okay, then you can have extremism, you can have children's armies, you can have Al-Qaeda, you can have all sorts of things. But you cannot solve these problems with hungry people. And you cannot solve the problems of hunger without some help, some strategy, because these places are dry, they're drought prone, they've got many, many deep problems. And that, I'm constantly saying it. Said it to the president recently. I talked to, throughout Congress, and today with leading a member of Congress and so on. But it's very hard. We've got a lot of momentum on the military, which I find just completely wrong-headed.
And I just had a program on the air yesterday, a half-hour program I did on how global warming, man-made global warming, is helping the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. They're now into their 11th year of a drought that is totally unnatural and is because of linked to man-made global warming. That's meant that there's this enormous unemployment among the young men in Afghanistan. In other words, man-made global warming is playing right into the hands of the terrorists there and in a number of other places around the planet. We had as our first guest a former chief of staff of the U.S. Army, explaining how they've done these studies that explain that exactly what Jeffrey is saying, made much worse by global warming, is increasing terrorism around the world. And that is why, in this fascinating question, which says, how can it not be global? That's why Copenhagen will be one of the most important events, whatever succeeds or doesn't succeed, in December, because it is all nations of the world trying to do what Jeffrey's talking about, which is agree together about how to work a big global problem together, which is, by the way, making military conflict worse anyway. So a lot of the leaders there are thinking about the fact that if they don't control global warming, nobody's going to be able to control the violence. And you're not.
I couldn't agree more. There's a swath of, it's called the drylands, that starts in Western Africa in a country called Senegal. And if you go across to the east, you go from Senegal to Mali, Niger, Chad, Sudan and Ethiopia, Somalia, Yemen, the Arabian Peninsula, Iran, Iraq, and now I'm going up into Central Asia. And if you look on the map, it's a little like a boomerang. It's a large 12,000-mile area of what are called the drylands based on low rainfall on average. That's where this Al-Qaeda is. That's where Darfur, Somalia with its pirates, Afghanistan, conflicts in northern Mali, and the Tuareg and so forth are taking place. I'm working in a lot of those countries. It's dry. The livestock are dying. People need help, and we need solutions. And there are some solutions. They're not great solutions, but there are some solutions. But I'll tell you one thing is no solution. I'm going to say it again. Strafing villages and bombing people and thinking, okay, we just get the Taliban leader or the Al-Qaeda leader. This is the most nonsensical idea. You don't think when you kill one that there aren't 10 more that will suddenly become the next Al-Qaeda leader? I mean, it's crazy, by the way. It just is anyone that spends a day in a camel herder village and sees what it's like, and the children are not in school, and people are struggling to survive, and the military is chasing terrorists around. It makes no sense, because I always say to them, don't send the Army, send the Army Corps of Engineers. Dig some wells, get some water, have a strategy, and we're still not there yet.
I'm sorry this could go on all night, but it can't go on all night. So I realized to my embarrassment that I did not acknowledge the enormous effort done by Wendy Hamilton, a member of our board, to put together a fundraising event tonight, and the tremendous generosity of the owners of New Cafe Julia, where many of you dined before this, and some of you were going to have a late dinner now. Thank Wendy and thank the owners of Cafe Julia. And on behalf of all of us here in this corner of the world, thank you, Jeffrey Sachs and Bill Wakemore. And thank you for coming. Everyone else, please drop those contact cards. Board members are right by the door. Please drop them. And if you want to take some of these books that Bill brought and reports,